I was summoned to an alien world because their oracles had visions of me. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Cal Darnell sat stiffly in the cramped confines of the diplomatic shuttle as it sliced through the alien atmosphere, its hull groaning from the sudden change in gravity. He had been on countless missions across the galaxy, negotiating treaties, resolving conflicts, and smoothing out interstellar misunderstandings, but this was different. This wasn't a carefully arranged political summit or an urgent plea for mediation. This was a summons, and not just any summons, but one that had come without context, without negotiations, without even an introduction. The alien race known as the Zuri had reached out directly to the Galactic Council, demanding his presence by name, as if he had always been part of their plans. That alone sent alarms blaring in his mind. The city unfolded beneath him as the shuttle descended, and for a moment Cal forgot his irritation. The entire metropolis floated above an endless ocean, anchored by towering spires of gleaming stone that stretched into the sky like fingers grasping for the heavens. Waterfalls cascaded from the edges, defying physics, vanishing into the clouds below, while bridges of glowing energy connected massive temple-like structures that pulsed with a strange rhythmic light. It was breathtaking, surreal, and utterly unlike anything he had ever seen before. But there was no time for admiration. The moment the shuttle docked, a procession of Zuri awaited him, their expectant gazes locked onto him like he was some kind of celestial being stepping into their world for the first time. The Zuri were tall, elegant, and unnervingly still as they watched him approach. Their lavender-toned skin shimmered faintly under the golden sky, and their large, luminous eyes reflected far more than just the sunlight. Cal adjusted his jacket, trying to project the composed authority of a seasoned diplomat, but the way they looked at him, like he was some foretold figure stepping off the pages of history, unsettled him. Then the oracles emerged, adorned in flowing silver robes, their foreheads marked with intricate glyphs. The oracles moved as if they weren't bound by the same laws of movement as everyone else, their gazes locked onto him. And the tallest among them, a figure with an air of unshakable certainty, raised a hand. "You have arrived, just as was foretold," he intoned, his voice carrying a weight that made the air around them feel heavy. "For 1,000 years, the vision spoke of this moment, of your presence among us. You are the one destined to bring balance to our world." Cal resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He had dealt with religious silas before, with prophecy-obsessed societies who thought fate dictated every moment of existence, and this already felt like a dangerously similar situation. "Right," he said, his voice edged with skepticism. "I'm going to need a little more than vague proclamations if you expect me to take this seriously. Why am I here specifically? Why me?" A murmur rippled through the gathered Zuri, but before the oracle could answer, another voice cut through the air, sharp and unimpressed. "He's nothing special." Cal turned his head and met the piercing gaze of Zavara, the High Priestess. Unlike the others who regarded him with reverence or cautious awe, she looked at him like he was a mistake. Her lavender skin gleamed under the temple's lights, and the long tail that flicked behind her was tipped with a crystal that pulsed softly, reacting to something unseen. Unlike the regal composure of the oracles, Zavara exuded irritation. Her arms crossed. Her weight shifted slightly as if she had far more important things to do than indulge in whatever cosmic nonsense they believed in. The oracle didn't even flinch at her dismissal. "The prophecy is clear, priestess. The human must stand at your side, as foretold." Zavara let out a slow breath, as if willing herself not to argue, before finally turning her gaze back to Calendar. "You are not what I expected," she said bluntly. "The visions made you sound significant." Cal narrowed his eyes, feeling his patience starting to fray. "I'm sorry if I don't live up to whatever mystical checklist you had in mind, but I didn't ask to be dragged here. I'm here because your people made a demand, and the Galactic Council thought it was better to humor you than risk a diplomatic incident." So why don't we skip the mystic nonsense and get to the point? Zara's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment something flickered behind her expression. Irritation, certainly, but also something else. She wasn't just annoyed at him. She was annoyed at this entire situation. He wasn't the only one unwilling to be here. The Oracle, clearly uninterested in their brewing tension, gestured toward the towering temple doors. The answers you seek lie within. There is much you must learn and little time to do so. You are more than you know. Cal Darnell. Cal wanted to argue, wanted to demand straight answers instead of this ominous, heavy-handed nonsense, but something about the way they spoke made his skin prickle. He wasn't a believer in fate, he wasn't one for destiny or cosmic plans, but something about this, about the way they had known his name, about the details they seemed certain of, unnerved him. Zara sighed, stepping forward, clearly begrudgingly accepting her role in this mess. "Fine," she muttered. "Let's get this over with." As she walked ahead, her tail swayed behind her, the crystal at the tip humming ever so slightly whenever she stepped too close to him. Cal caught the way she noticed it too, the flicker of unease in her expression as she turned away. Something about this wasn't right. He could feel it deep in his gut, and somehow he had the sinking suspicion that this was only the beginning. The halls of the temple were eerily silent as Cal walked beside Zara, their footsteps swallowed by the sheer vastness of the space. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, a strange blend of something floral and something metallic, and soft blue lights pulsed from crystalline sconces embedded into the towering stone walls. It felt ancient, sacred in a way that sent an uncomfortable shiver down his spine, like he was trespassing in a place that had been waiting for him far longer than it should have. He hated that thought. He had spent years in negotiations, stepping into war zones and high-stakes summits, but nothing had ever made him feel so out of place. The oracles may have been convinced that he belonged here, but every fiber of his being was screaming otherwise. Zara walked ahead, her long tail flicking once in irritation, the crystal at the tip faintly glowing every time she passed too close to him. She was making a pointed effort not to acknowledge it, though the tension in her shoulders said she felt it just as much as he did. He wasn't sure what to make of that. She had been dismissive of him from the start, unimpressed, even irritated that he had been summoned here, but that reaction, that carefully concealed unease, told him there was more to this than simple reluctance. "You're walking too slow," she said suddenly, voice clipped as she glanced over her shoulder. "This is a temple, not a leisurely tour." Cal arched a brow, quickening his pace just enough to fall and step beside her. "Forgive me for not knowing the protocol for being randomly dropped into a centuries-old prophecy. You're acting like this is just another Tuesday for you." She let out a sharp exhale, her jaw tightening. "I didn't ask for this either." There it was, that edge in her voice. He was right. She didn't want this any more than he did. He studied her as they walked, noting the way her fingers flexed at her sides like she was holding herself back from saying something she shouldn't. She was the High Priestess, the supposed chosen figure of her people's sacred traditions, and yet she was radiating resentment with every breath. "You really don't believe in this, do you?" he said, watching for her reaction. "For someone who's supposed to be leading all of this, you're taking it pretty badly." She stopped walking so suddenly that he nearly bumped into her. When she turned to face him, her violet eyes were sharper than before, no longer just irritated but weighing something. "I believe in my people," she said, her voice lower now, more controlled, like she was speaking to herself as much as him. "I believe in the traditions that have shaped our civilization for thousands of years. But do I believe that a prophecy written centuries ago should dictate my life? No, and I certainly don't believe that you, some outsider who had never even heard of us until now, are the answer to anything." There was no hesitation in her words, no wavering. She truly meant it, and somehow that was almost reassuring. Cal had been worried that he'd be dealing with yet another religious fanatic, someone who would treat him like some divine being whether he wanted it or not. But Zara was different. She didn't buy into this any more than he did, and yet despite her resistance, she was still here, still following along, still trapped just as much as he was. Before he could respond, a deep chime rang through the halls, reverberating through the stone like a heartbeat. Zara's expression darkened. "We're late," she muttered, turning back toward the path ahead. Cal followed, his mind still turning over everything she had just admitted. She was a High Priestess who didn't believe in her own prophecy. He wasn't sure if that made things better or worse. The grand chamber they stepped into was unlike anything he had ever seen. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, vanishing into shadows where golden light trickled down like liquid stars. A massive orb of swirling energy hovered at the center, suspended in midair, shifting between deep blues and rich purples, occasionally flickering with white-hot bursts of power. Surrounding it were towering stone pillars, each inscribed with intricate carvings that pulsed with their own internal glow, and beneath it, kneeling in solemn silence, were the oracles. Cal barely had a second to process the sheer weight of the scene before the lead oracle rose to his feet, lifting his hands toward the energy above. "The moment has come," he intoned, his voice carrying across the vast chamber. "The convergence has begun." Cal exchanged a look with Zara, who merely exhaled through her nose in clear frustration before stepping forward. "We are here," she said, her voice laced with forced patience. "Now tell us what this actually means." The oracle regarded her for a long moment before shifting his gaze to Calendar. The vision spoke of a human arriving in our most desperate hour, when the balance of our world teeters on the edge of chaos. The one who stands beside the priestess is not merely an outsider, but a force of change, a force of unity. His gaze sharpened. "That force is you." Cal folded his arms. "I'm going to need something more concrete than force of change." The oracle didn't seem deterred by his skepticism. Instead, he stepped closer, his glowing eyes searching Cal's face, like he was reading something beneath the surface. "You are bound to the priestess in ways neither of you yet understand. Your presence is no accident. The crystal in her tail responds to you, does it not?" Zara stiffened. Cal glanced at her, noticing the way her tail twitched slightly, the crystal at the tip glowing in time with his breath. She had noticed it. She just hadn't said anything. The oracle's lips curved in something that was almost amusement. "The connection has already begun." Zara scowled. "It means nothing." The oracle merely turned, gesturing toward the swirling energy above them. "The bond between you must be completed. Only then will the balance be restored." Cal clenched his jaw. "And what exactly does completed mean?" The oracle's expression was unreadable. "A union, a merging of two fates." Zara's tail flicked violently behind her, the crystal flaring with sudden light before dimming again. "Absolutely not." Cal couldn't help but agree. He had no interest in being forced into some ritual, some ancient bond dictated by forces neither of them understood. And yet, as he looked at Zara, at the way her body was reacting against her will, at the way she was fighting it with every ounce of control she had, a terrible thought settled in his mind. What if the prophecy was right? What if they didn't have a choice? The chamber was suffocating with expectation, the weight of unseen forces pressing down on Cal and Zara, as the oracle stood waiting, their unreadable gazes locked on them like they were merely actors fulfilling a script written long before their births. The swirling energy above pulsed rhythmically, shifting between deep indigos and crackling whites, each shift sending a faint vibration through the air. Everything in this place, from the architecture to the very atmosphere, seemed designed to force submission, to make anyone standing here believe that resistance was futile. Zara exhaled slowly, the flick of her tail betraying her agitation, as she turned to face the oracles with a sharpness that suggested she was seconds away from tearing their so-called prophecy apart with nothing but words. "I will not participate in this farce," she stated, her voice controlled but dripping with defiance. "I have given my life to the temple. upheld the traditions of our people, and done everything required of me. But I will not be forced into some absurd cosmic pairing because of a vision dictated by men who have never once lived outside these walls. Cal watched her, feeling the strange mix of admiration and unease. She was standing against the very foundation of her civilization, the weight of thousands of years of prophecy pressing down on her, and yet she refused to yield. But as much as he respected her fire, he couldn't shake the fact that the oracles didn't seem concerned at all. They stood silent, unshaken, as if they had already known how she would react. The lead oracle's glowing eyes didn't so much as flicker. Denial does not change fate. Zara's tail snapped against the floor in irritation, her fists clenching at her sides, but she didn't dignify the statement with a response. Instead, she turned her sharp gaze to Calendar. Leave. You don't have to entertain this any longer. Cal ran a hand through his hair, trying to find the right words to respond to that. The problem was, leaving wasn't that simple. The Galactic Council had sent him here in good faith, thinking this was just a diplomatic request, something to smooth over misunderstandings and strengthen alliances. If he left without so much as an effort to understand what was going on, it could cause unnecessary tension, maybe even damage the fragile relationships between the Zari and the broader galactic community. But more than that, something about the way the Oracle spoke with such unwavering certainty was digging into his mind in a way he couldn't shake. "This is bigger than just me walking away," he finally said, his tone measured, though he could see how much Zara hated hearing it. "I don't buy into destiny. I don't believe in fate. But I also don't ignore things that don't add up. The fact that your people knew my name, knew exactly when I would arrive, none of that is normal. And whether I like it or not, that means I need to figure out what the hell is actually going on here." Zara's expression flickered just slightly, like she hadn't expected him to say that. She had assumed he would run, that he would take the first opportunity to remove himself from the insanity surrounding them. But he wasn't someone who walked away just because something made him uncomfortable. The Oracle's lips curved in something that might have been a faint smile. "Then you have already taken the first step toward understanding." Cal frowned, glancing at Zara. "And what exactly does that mean?" The Oracle gestured toward the energy above them, his voice calm, almost too composed. "The prophecy does not dictate your actions. It only reveals the path that has already been set into motion. Whether you walk it willingly or fight against it, the outcome remains the same. The balance must be restored. The bond must be formed." Zara looked ready to snap, but Cal held up a hand before she could start another fight. "And let's say, hypothetically, we ignore all of that. What happens then?" The Oracle's expression didn't change. "The world fractures. The ocean consumes the city, and the Zari will cease to exist." Silence settled heavily in the chamber, the weight of the words sinking into the space between them. Zara scoffed, though there was something forced about it. "Dramatic nonsense. The ocean has never consumed the city. It is held in place by the very forces that built it." The Oracle's gaze flicked toward the swirling energy above them. "And yet, even you feel the changes, do you not?" Cal watched as something flickered across Zora's face, something he hadn't seen before. Hesitation. It was brief, barely noticeable, but it was there. The Oracle turned his attention back to Calendar. "You have more questions. They will be answered in time. But for now, understand this. You are here because you were always meant to be here, and you will not leave until the bond is complete." Cal clenched his jaw, every instinct screaming against the idea of being forced into something beyond his control. "I don't like threats." "It is not a threat," the Oracle said simply. "It is truth." Zara let out a sharp breath, turning away before the argument could continue. "Enough of this. I refuse to stand here and listen to this anymore." She started toward the exit, and for a brief second, Cal considered staying, considered trying to press the oracles for more concrete answers, but the logical side of him told him that he wouldn't get anything more from them than what they had already given. With a final glance at the floating energy above, He turned and followed Zara out. The halls felt colder than before as they walked in silence, tension thick between them. Finally, Zara spoke, her voice lower than before, her pace never slowing. You shouldn't have entertained them. The more you listen, the more they twist things to sound like truth. Cal studied her as they walked. Then tell me something, Zara. If it's all nonsense, why did you hesitate? She didn't stop walking, didn't acknowledge the question, but the way her tail flicked slightly behind her, the faint glow of the crystal at the tip reacting once more to his presence, told him that she had no real answer. Something was happening here, something neither of them could ignore, and whether she liked it or not, whether he liked it or not, the longer he stayed, the more convinced he became that leaving wasn't going to be as simple as walking away. And worse than that, some part of him wasn't sure if he wanted to walk away anymore. The temple hall stretched before them in an endless maze of stone and light, the faint hum of distant energy pulsating through the air as Cal followed Zara through the winding corridors. She hadn't said a word since they'd left the chamber, her shoulders tight, her movements clipped with an agitation that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with the situation unraveled around them. He could feel it too, that creeping sense that they had stepped into something much larger than either of them had been prepared for. You didn't answer my question back there, Cal said, breaking the silence as they turned a corner. If this is all just ridiculous mysticism, why did you hesitate when the oracle mentioned the changes? Zara exhaled through her nose, her tail flicking behind her, the crystal at its tip glowing faintly once more as she walked. She wasn't going to answer at first. He could tell from the way her fingers twitched, from the way she kept her gaze fixed ahead, like acknowledging him would only make things worse. But finally, she stopped walking, turning to face him with an expression that was less anger and more frustration, the kind that came from fighting against something she didn't want to admit was real. You don't understand our world, she said, her voice low, measured, as if she were choosing her words carefully. The balance they speak of, it isn't just some abstract idea. It's real. The temple, the city, our way of life, all of it exists in harmony with forces older than our civilization itself. But something has been shifting. The tides have grown unpredictable. The currents beneath the city, the energy that holds it afloat, have started to waver. It's subtle, but it's happening. Cal frowned, crossing his arms as he studied her. So you do think something's wrong? She exhaled sharply, rolling her shoulders like she was trying to shake off the weight of her own admission. Believing that something is wrong is not the same as believing in a prophecy that claims you are the solution to it. That was fair. He wouldn't have believed it either if their positions were reversed. But the fact remained, she knew something was happening. She could feel it. That was enough to make him pause, to reconsider the weight of the words spoken in the oracle chamber. Before he could press her further, a sudden tremor shook the temple, the walls vibrating as a low, deep hum filled the air. It wasn't violent, wasn't strong enough to send them staggering, but it was there, a ripple of something deep beneath the surface, something that hadn't been there before. Zara stiffened immediately, her gaze snapping upward as though she could sense something in the very bones of the city itself. Cal steadied himself, his instincts flaring as the hum deepened, a strange resonance that felt alive, as if the temple itself were responding to something unseen. "Tell me that's normal," he muttered. Zara didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed his wrist and pulled him forward, her pace suddenly urgent, her previous irritation replaced with something far more pressing. "We need to get to the inner sanctum." Cal let her lead him, not bothering to argue, because for the first time since he'd arrived, he could see it, genuine concern in her expression. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It wasn't something she could dismiss as superstition. The corridors grew narrower as they descended into the deeper levels of the temple, the once grand architecture giving way to something more ancient, rougher, like this part of the structure had existed long before the city above had been built. The hum followed them, pooling through the walls like a heartbeat, growing stronger with every step. It wasn't until they reached a vast circular chamber that Zara finally let go of him, stepping forward toward a towering structure in the center of the room. A monolithic crystal, its surface swirling with the same energy that had filled the oracle chamber. Cal took a slow breath, staring up at it, the sheer presence of the thing pressing against his senses like standing too close to an exposed power core. "Okay," he said after a beat. "I'm starting to see why you're worried." Zara's jaw tightened as she approached the crystal, placing a hand against its surface. The moment her skin made contact, the glow inside it pulsed violently, shifting erratically, colors bleeding together in a way that looked wrong. Her tail curled behind her, the crystal at its tip reacting again, its hum matching the chaotic rhythm of the monolith before her. "This is the heart of Aura," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "It has guided our people for centuries, maintained the balance that keeps the city above the tides. It is the foundation of everything." Cal stepped forward cautiously. "And I'm guessing it's not supposed to be doing that." Zara shook her head, her fingers pressing slightly against the crystal, as if trying to anchor it, to steady whatever was unraveling inside it. "Something is disrupting it, something external." Cal wasn't a scientist, but he knew enough to recognize instability when he saw it. The way the energy within the crystal churned, the way it fought against itself, it wasn't just a random fluctuation. It was reacting to something, to someone. His stomach twisted slightly as a thought surfaced, one he really didn't want to acknowledge. "What if it's me?" Zara's gaze snapped to him, her tail flicking sharply. "Don't flatter yourself." "Yeah, I'd love to, but let's not ignore the fact that this thing just started having a meltdown after I showed up." He gestured at the swirling chaos inside the monolith. "Your oracles were a little too certain that I was tied to this place, and I don't exactly have a history of breaking reality. So unless you've had another human guest recently, I think we both know the common denominator here." Zavera clenched her jaw, but she didn't immediately dismiss the idea, which told him all he needed to know. She didn't want to believe it, but she wasn't stupid enough to ignore the possibility. Before either of them could say anything else, the hum in the room spiked, the crystal flashing with an intensity that sent a wave of pressure outward. Zara staggered back, her balance thrown off for the first time since he'd met her, and Cal barely had time to react before the monolith's glow turned blinding white, filling the chamber with a crackling energy that sent shivers racing down his spine. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the light vanished. The crystal dimmed, its chaotic swirling suddenly still, as though it had burned itself out in an instant. The air in the chamber felt thinner now, emptier, like something had been taken from it. Zara took a slow step forward, staring at the crystal, her voice quieter now. "This isn't just a disturbance," she said, more to herself than to him. This is something breaking." Cal exhaled, his mind racing. If that was true, then there was no walking away from this. The oracles had said the city would fall if the bond wasn't completed, and now, for the first time, he wasn't entirely sure they were wrong. The chamber was unnervingly quiet in the aftermath, the lingering hum of energy dissipating into a thick, charged silence. The heart of Aura no longer pulsed with its usual rhythmic glow. It was dim now, inert in a way that sent a deep unease crawling down Cal's spine. Whatever had just happened wasn't just an anomaly, it was a warning. He could feel it in his gut, in the way the air felt thinner now, like the very foundation of the temple had lost something vital. And yet Zara stood still, staring at the monolithic crystal with a look that wasn't just concern, but something sharper, something bordering on fear. Cal exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face before breaking the silence. "I take it that's not normal." Zara didn't respond immediately. Her tail flicked behind her, the crystal at the tip still glowing faintly, reacting to something unseen. Then finally, she took a slow step forward, reaching out toward the heart again, her fingers hovering just above the surface. This time, when she made contact, nothing happened. No pulse, no hum, no flicker of energy. It was as if the heart had simply shut down. Her jaw tightened. It's never gone silent before. Cal watched her carefully, studying the tension in her posture, the way her fingers curled slightly at her sides, like she was holding something back. He didn't know her well, but he'd seen enough politicians, warriors, and leaders to recognize when someone was forcing control over emotions they didn't want to show. And right now, Zara was barely holding it together. "So what does that mean?" he asked, keeping his tone measured. "If this thing keeps your city from sinking, and it's just stopped working, then we have a serious problem, don't we?" Zara's eyes flicked to him, irritation flashing behind them. "I don't need you stating the obvious." "Good," he said, unfazed, "because I'd rather hear solutions than stand around pretending this isn't bad." She let out a slow breath, turning away from the heart, pacing a few steps before she stopped abruptly. "The oracles," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "They knew something was happening. They called you here because they believed the prophecy would fix it." She clenched her fists, her tail curling slightly behind her. "But if the prophecy was wrong, if you're not actually the solution, then we have no plan, no course of action, and that means this city is on borrowed time." Cal didn't like the way that sounded. "How much time are we talking about?" Zavara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the heart, studying the still surface with something unreadable behind her expression. "Days. Weeks, at most. If the balance is truly breaking, then the ocean will begin reclaiming aura. The city will fall." Cal ran a hand down his face, letting out a slow breath. "Fantastic. So not only am I not actually part of some grand prophecy, but now I'm also stuck in the middle of an impending catastrophe." Tavera shot him a sharp look. "You're not stuck here. If you want to leave, no one is stopping you." "Yeah, and I'd love to do that. Trust me," Cal said, meeting her glare without hesitation. "But let's be real. Your people dragged me into this mess, and I can't just walk away while everything is falling apart around me. Besides, even if I left, I'd still have to explain to the Galactic Council why I abandoned an entire civilization when I might have had a way to help. That doesn't exactly look great on my record." She exhaled sharply, clearly irritated but not disagreeing with him. "Look," he continued, stepping closer, lowering his voice slightly. "I know you don't believe in the prophecy, and frankly, I don't either. But something is happening here, something that started right when I arrived. We can't ignore that. So instead of wasting time arguing about fate, let's figure out the real problem and fix it." Zara was silent for a long moment, her jaw tight, her fingers flexing at her sides, as if she were weighing the options, calculating the risks. Then finally, she let out a slow breath, turning away. "The oracles won't help us," she said, voice steady, but laced with something heavier now. "They believe in destiny too deeply. If they see the heart failing, they'll see it as proof that you and I must complete the bond to restore balance." Cal frowned. "And if we do?" She hesitated then. "They'll force it." That sent a chill down his spine. "You're saying they'd actually—" "What?" "Try to make us go through with it." Her gaze darkened slightly. "They wouldn't call it force. They'd call it divine will. But make no mistake, they would not let us refuse." Cal let that sink in, running through the possible outcomes in his head. If the oracles were that committed to their prophecy, then there was no telling what they'd do to ensure it happened. And considering how much of their civilization revolved around their supposed foresight, he doubted any rational argument would convince them otherwise. "All right," he said finally. "Then we need to move before they realize what's happening." Zara glanced at him, something flickering behind her expression. "Move where?" "To find out what's really going on," Cal said. "You said it yourself. The balance is breaking. But we don't know why. If it's not actually me causing this, then something else is, and we need to figure out what before your city collapses into the ocean." Zavara studied him as if searching for some ulterior motive, but whatever she saw must have been enough. After a long moment, she exhaled and nodded. "There may be another way," she admitted. The heart of Ara was created long before the oracles ever came into power. There are records, lost texts, fragments of history buried beneath the temple. If there's another way to restore balance, it will be there. Cal nodded. Then let's find it, before anyone notices what we're up to. But even as he said it, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone already had. The descent into the lower chambers of the temple was unlike anything Cal had experienced before. The air grew denser the further they went, the warmth of the main halls giving way to a cool, almost electric stillness. The architecture changed, shifting from the pristine, well-maintained stone of the temple above to something older, more primitive. The walls were carved from dark rock, etched with faded inscriptions that flickered faintly as they passed. The further they walked, the more Cal realized that this part of the temple had been forgotten, buried beneath centuries of reverence for the structures above. The oracles had built their empire on top of something far older, and for the first time since he arrived, he wondered if they had ever truly understood what they were worshipping. Zara moved ahead with purpose, her posture tense but controlled, the glow from her tail crystal casting strange shadows against the stone. She hadn't spoken much since they'd left the chamber with the heart, but Cal could tell from the way she walked that her mind was working through something, calculating possibilities, outcomes. She wasn't just blindly following old myths. She was looking for the truth, and that was something he could respect. He exhaled, his footsteps echoing slightly as he walked beside her. "So let me get this straight," he said, voice low. "The oracles built their entire belief system around the heart, but they don't actually know how it works."